Welcome to the Atlantico podcast, where we talk about the science behind the Atlantico project, the Atlantic Ocean, and the human adventures experienced along the way. Here, we have conversations with guests from around the world who work together so that we can better understand, manage, and protect the ocean. So let's embark on the journey of Atlantico and discover the world that lies above and beneath the surface of the beautiful Atlantic Ocean. Welcome back to the Atlantico podcast, and today our episode is focused on the High Seas Treaty, which was the focus of intense discussions during the Intergovernmental Conference on Marine Biodiversity of Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction, or BBNJ for short. The treaty deals with the high seas, so these are those regions of the ocean which lie outside of national boundaries and for which, up to now, there were essentially no regulations, and especially very little enforcement of what regulations there were. And this in terms of navigation, fishing, research, or use of marine resources from these regions. So this treaty establishes a framework for the legal mechanisms to protect the ocean and its marine biodiversity, including in support of the pledge to protect 30% of the ocean by 2030. Which was made during the UN Biodiversity Conference back in December 2022. And to talk about this in more detail and gain a better understanding, we have two guests today. André Abreu from the Tara Ocean Foundation in France and a returning guest, Hugo Sarmento from the Federal University of São Carlos in Brazil. Let's start the conversation with André. Hi and welcome. André, can you quickly tell us who you are and what you do?
Hi, Eloise. Hi, colleagues, friends of Atlantico, friends of the ocean. I'm André. I work at the Tara Ocean Foundation since 12 years now, and especially on the science to policy interface, working for a better understanding of the science for better ocean governance in several domains, ocean and climate nexus, but also the High Seas Treaty, which has been just approved last weekend, and we are still under the impact of this conclusion of more than 15 years of negotiations.
And we're here to talk exactly about that. So can you tell us a little bit more about the treaty, its history, and what it entails? So what is it all about?
Actually, when states approved the Convention of the Law of the Sea, the Convention of Montego Bay, it was far in 1973. We didn't have idea of the issues that are today threatening biodiversity on the seas and even in the high seas. So the biodiversity was not included in this first instrument that was approved in 82 at the end. And since the beginning of years 2000, actually some delegations started to think about a complementary treaty, a new instrument to complete the Law of the Sea Convention, addressing issues to sustainable use and conserve the biodiversity beyond areas of national jurisdiction. So it started actually in 2010, just before the Rio Plus 20 conference, we addressed this issue in a document. And the Rio Plus 20 conference, we approved the package, as we say, for this treaty. Package in 4 parts, addressing issues of conservation and impact assessment of activities, but also the management of we call now MGRs, marine genetic resources. So dealing with science, dealing with permits to go to the sea, how we manage to conserve the high seas. So this package was approved in the Rio Plus 20 conference. And after we had 15 years of negotiations in the UN, starting with what we call informal negotiations and then going to an intergovernmental conference that started in 2017. So we just passed more than 12 years discussing this instrument, these issues, and it's not easy because it's a mandatory agreement. It's an instrument of international law. It's not only soft laws, not only goodwill, like, for instance, the Sustainable Development Goals, which lies on the goodwill of the states for implementation of the measures. We're talking about an international treaty, which is binding. The rules will be mandatory for all states that decides to ratify it. It's really a big step for the ocean. And we have good instruments. It's not perfect because there's a lot of politics behind it. You can imagine how to regulate areas for protection on the Arctic, on the Antarctic, on the Southern Ocean, near the China Sea. So we had to overcome a lot of barriers to go to the text.
And you were actually present during the negotiations which took place in New York last week, as you mentioned, but it will have been a couple of weeks when the episode comes out next week. So can you tell us a little bit about the backstage of the negotiations and the very important role that the Tara Ocean Foundation has played in reaching this important milestone over the years?
Sure. We are following this negotiation since 2012, actually, as the Tara is an observer for the United Nations Economic and Scientific Council. So we can go to the floor and we can advise delegates. We can propose items for discussion. We can organize side events. We can edit policy briefs and launch these policy briefs with receptions, dialogues, delegates. But what is really important here is to understand that these delegates that are in the UN negotiating this text are mainly jurists, lawyers, because we are talking about international law, but they are not familiar with science. And when we go to MGRs, to genomics, to genetics, to sequences, to digital information regulations, it's quite complex, actually, quite technical issues. So we had hard work to put scientists in front of the negotiators to bridge the science to policy, to push for more understanding of the scientific issues that are behind this treaty, because actually the treaty will also regulate access to these resources, to this data, including digital data. So it's new to international law to regulate digital data, which is in open source, in the data banks. But we invited several scientists, including Hugo here with us today, to discuss with delegates. Hugo participated with the Brazilian delegation in the last week of negotiations. And I think it was a good move by the foundation because scientists identified with ocean biodiversity are mainly working on fish, dolphins, whales, sharks, coral reefs. And they are not familiar with genomics, with metagenomics, with data analysis. So really, we felt a need to invite this community working on the microbiome to participate in the discussions, but it was not the case. So we had some side events, we organized workshops and meetings, informal meetings, bilateral meetings, trying to overcome these gaps of understanding between the scientists and the experts.
So maybe on a more personal note, how was it? How was your week there in New York? How does it happen? What takes place there?
Well, it was really difficult. The first week, we had the impression that things were a bit freezed. Actually, the group of developing countries were pushing since the beginning for common heritage of mankind status for the high seas. And northern countries, developed countries, were wishing to preserve the spirit of the freedom of the high seas, which is also in the convention in the beginning. So this issue was quite blocked to the end, but also issues on how to decide where we can establish protected areas in the high seas. It was really, really political. China and Russia, as you can imagine, as we see in the Antarctic Convention, are not very, very optimistic and very positive about this discussion. So it was quite hard with the Chinese, the Russians, and other countries like Japan also, Korea, Iceland, that were a bit hard to accept the idea of protected areas. But we have it. We have it, and it will be not for consensus, which is important. So we struggled, especially on this issue, to make them accept the ideas that a vote, qualified majority will be enough to propose a protected area. And so these things we discuss in corridors a lot, delegates. We identify some delegates which are real champions and which can hear the civil society and can be our speaker in the negotiations. Some sessions were closed for civil society, especially big 40-hour final session without sleeping they had from Friday to Saturday night. We were not in the room, but we worked with some delegates that were in the room. And the final sprint was a bit emotional because Friday we felt, oh my God, we don't have time, and we have a lot of brackets to work with, and we have a lot of options to decide before this evening. And it seemed difficult, but finally the president of the session, Madam Rina Lee, a fighter woman that fought for the treaty to the end, she said, no, we will have the treaty. We won't sleep here. We'll stay here till the treaty. And it was the case. They stayed up almost 40 hours non-stop negotiating. So it was an amazing experience. I think it's a victory also for the scientific community because the scientific regulations that were decided are quite nice. I mean, they are not too heavy for scientists in terms of compliance, of reporting. These were also points where we worked a lot to make it cool for scientists in terms of participating in the convention. And finally, the issue of funding is a very nice news for all scientists working in the ocean because we have a special fund that will be dedicated to fund developing countries to participate in international cooperation programs for the high seas.
So it sounds like a really intense experience, and it must have been really emotional when you reached that point where everybody agreed. Well, almost everybody. So yeah, that brings me to my next question. What are the next steps now? What is still to happen to formally adopt the text?
It's still not there. We are still not there. We need now to revise in 6 languages the text, to translate it, and to approve the 6th version of the text with some nuances, some difference between languages that must be approved carefully. And then we need 60 countries to ratify it to enter into force of the agreement. So we work now, and there's a high ambition coalition for the high seas that was created last year in France, which now push for these ratifications as soon as possible. We had experience like the Paris Treaty that was ratified the same year, less than 1 year after the approval. But we had also conventions like Convention of Montego Bay that took almost 20 years to enter into force. But we are optimists because in the High Ambition Coalition, we have 52 countries. If these 52 accept to ratify, I think we'll get there in 2 or 3 years.
Well, so not quite there yet, but on the good way. So thanks, André, for sharing your experience with us. I'm going to now turn to Hugo. So Hugo, welcome back to the podcast. It has been a while since I spoke to you.
Hi, Louise. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So now we've heard about the treaty, its history, and what is the status at the moment. Can you tell us more about how the treaty will impact on research and on bioprospection?
Sure. So as André explained, the high seas has no owner. So the situation here is that rich countries have the means in terms of ships and technology to take samples anywhere in the ocean, make bioprospection, and eventually some enterprises can make profits from these genetic resources from the ocean, right? And as André explained, the question is, who is the owner of these resources? So is it a company, a country? In the moment, without regulation, is open. And what we know from the past is that open access often leads to disasters. So an important point that was reached in this treaty was that these resources were seen as a resource for humanity. So also belonging to rich countries and poor countries. So was created a mechanism. If we make some money from genetic resources from the ocean, a part of this money will go to these funds that will be used in research. So that's very good news, also from southern countries' perspective. So how did it affect research? So that was your question. What we do in Atlanteco, for example, is where we go in our ships and we take samples and then we sequence the DNA to make research, understand how the ocean works. But these sequences are deposited in open access databases that anyone can access, even private companies that then can develop these bioproducts. So how can we control this without too much constraint for research? Because if we do too much paperwork and too much difficulties to run science, it's also a problem. So actually, it's very difficult to get to a good compromise between allowing and being open science available for everybody and make it fair for all the countries. We get to a very good compromise here, and that's where the scientists were consulted and where we can give some inputs to how this can be done. Okay, so it's a very complex debate, a very complex question, but we managed to get a good compromise that was we can still do science quite easily. We have some compliance to make, which was not the case in the past. So we have to declare where we're going to sample. The geographic location is very important. Was not the case in the past. So we say where we took the sample. This goes to public databases. And then if some profit is made from these sequences, which is already the case, for example, for coronavirus vaccine, uses already some genes from the ocean. So it's a practical example of this works really affects everybody's life in the end. So it's very critical. And we expect that in the future, we have more and more products from genetic resources from the ocean. So this is very critical point.
Yes, so we hope that this will come into force sooner rather than later. So can you give us your perspective on the southern countries' point of view and on how Brazil is being involved in the negotiations?
Yeah, so Brazil has a sad story on biodiversity because it's a very rich country in biodiversity. We have the Amazon, as you know. And in the past, some people with bad intentions used to go to the forests. Of course, you can sample the forests and try endless plants searching for active chemicals. But it's much easier if you go and speak to the people that live there for centuries. And they use these plants. So that's why we have a legislation in Brazil that link genetic resources with traditional knowledge. So you use traditional knowledge to direct you to the right plants. And then you can make patents from the plants. That's how it used to be. So these people come to the forest, ask the people for traditional knowledge, take the plants and make patents. And Brazil and the traditional populations don't get any profit from it. That was a big problem. It happened a lot in the past. So Brazil has one of the most advanced regulations on biodiversity. On that subject, there is Nagoya Treaty for all genetic resources that regulates this access to traditional knowledge and genetic resources. And Brazil was one of the first to ratify and to implement regulation on that. So we have an informatics system where we comply, we declare every single sample, and there are several checkpoints from the university point of view, then the ministry, we have all these checkpoints to organize this information of what resources are being accessed by who and where. So if I send a sample to France, to sequence the DNA, for example, we have to sign some papers and do some bureaucracy, but it's a way to comply that we are accessing the genetic resources. So in that sense, Brazil had a very important role in negotiations because it was representing not only South America, also Central America, I think. So it represented a bigger geographic region with big genetic resources. And with this experience of already having law and systems to control the access to genetic resources. So I was contacted by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Brazil. I was consulted to know how that happened in the ocean, right? Because they had a lot of experience in the Amazon with plants and animals, but in the ocean was quite new to them. I represented Atlanteco to give this scientific expertise. And we got to a reasonable solution that can be not too heavy for science and still have some control. brought this to the negotiations, these proposals. Of course, our proposal was in line with what we have been doing in Atlanteco and with Tara Foundation. So this helped a lot as well. And we were very happy with the outcome that the genetic resources were in the end considered a resource for humanity and not only for few people or few companies or few countries.
Yeah, so I don't think most people will realize how much effort or how long this has taken to get to this point, and how much effort is still required to put it into practice or to make it legally binding. So we'll follow that in the weeks, months, and hopefully not too many years to come. So before we end, is there anything else you wanted to mention?
Yeah, I would like to come back to Atlanteco, Eloise, to mention that actually in the 3D, we have the possibility to propose new tools for monitoring, area-based management tools that needs science to understand more about these high seas that are not well known in some big areas of the high seas. There's few data. So there will be also very nice opportunities, I think, for programs like Atlanteco to propose innovative tools with genomics, with satellite imaging, involving all the countries of the South Atlantic. And we hope the scientific advisory board that we created for the treaty will also be a strong board with this that understand the issues we are talking about, and that will be an opportunity for push and to foster international cooperation for the high seas.
And hopefully we can get that workforce from Atlanteco, but also all the other projects that work on the Atlantic or any kind of marine research really to come together and help in that respect. So I think all I have to do now is to thank you both for shedding a bit of light on this massive achievement, and we'll follow it up and see what happens in the coming months.
Thanks a lot, Eloise, for the opportunity to share.
Yeah. Thanks, Eloise. This has been a great opportunity and to tell people how important this is for everybody, for humanity.
We hope that you've enjoyed today's episode and look forward to seeing you next time. You can follow the Atlanteco project on our website on www.atlanteco.eu, and you can also find us on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook. All the links and information on the project and on today's episode is in the show notes. Atlanteco is a project funded under Horizon 2020, a European Union research and innovation programme.